This is our lecture on form. Now, it's not shape, which is flat and two-dimensional, but form is basically what 3D art is. It occupies 3D space, and it's often not so easy to define, but here's a limited definition. The actual physical contour of a work, the volume or mass that it carves out in space. For example, this is Tony Smith's steel cube called die, or one dice. But in some works, it's not so obvious. For example, pots. You see here a table of thrown ceramic forms. And the forms are basically the mass, the shells, enclosing an empty space. And this is what that empty space is called the volume. There's the mass, which is the physical part, and then the volume on the inside. But it's not that it's nothing. As you can see on some of these forms, you can basically see that positive force of that volume pushing out on the outside ceramic shell. We also have works like this plexiglass form, where the pieces are almost non-existent. They take up very little space. They're almost, well, they are transparent, some of these, and the only way we can really see this form is from these lights that are catching the edges here, where there is a connection. And then this has some kind of cool fiber optic sort of things going on inside of it. And yet this whole thing, you would say, well, what is the form? Well, basically the form is this entire thing, even though it is nothing. And this space inside, which we see as a void, is really kind of an activated entity in itself. So there again, sometimes not so easy to define. Here's some more, some contemporary seating design. You can almost not see it except for a little bit of this reflection and these edges that catch the light. What else do we have here? This is a cool kind of plexiglass piece. There's almost nothing there. I mean, this plexiglass takes up so little space in itself, and yet this whole piece becomes the form. This space, this interior space, which I wouldn't call a negative space, it's more of an interior form. This is actually part of the activated space of this piece. So we're going to talk in this lecture, we're going to talk about 5 different things. And there's a couple of kind of this versus that kind of things. We've got interior and exterior forms. So in these glass bowl kind of C-form shapes by Dale Chihuly, these outer forms, well, the whole thing here is a piece, although I would say he probably constructs these every time he puts in an installation. But in this case, this is one whole piece, and there are these exterior forms and this interior form. But in this lecture, interior and exterior forms, we're going to look at primary and secondary contours. We're going to look at negative and positive forms, static versus dynamic forms, and then we're going to look at the styles of forms. So this is our first one. I've sort of explained to you this interior versus the exterior forms. And oftentimes, artists that work with stone, they kind of talk about how they are revealing what is actually inside. This is piece is by Michelangelo, and it's called Bound Slave. And he has a number of these, and no one is really sure, at least to my knowledge, of whether they're actually finished or whether they, and intended that way, intended to show sort of the outer forces constraining the freedom or the inner life of this human being here. I mean, is this sort of the statement, or is it just an unfinished piece? So we've got kind of the interior form and the exterior form. Here's another one where they're actually two completely separate items. We've got this exterior form, which is the holder of these wrapped eggs. This is actually kind of a Japanese art form where they, before they were using plastic bags, they would, very artfully and carefully wrap things. I mean, you can see it in their obis and kimonos, right? I mean, they take it very seriously. And this might be how if you went to the market and said, give me 10 eggs, well, they might hand you 2 of these little things. And so we have an exterior artfully done kind of folk art form, and then the eggs, the thing that you're carrying on the inside. Then we've got funny things like this, that this piece of furniture, in this case this desk, is made of a mesh, a metal mesh that's transparent in a way. So you can actually you could see the person's legs, or if there were files and books under here. So we can sort of see through the thing. So you've got an exterior form, but this is also part of it too, this interior form. Same with these very cool chairs. Exterior and the interior, and even this little sort of inside the donut kind of shape. So you can see how people are really playing with that whole idea of what is exterior and what is interior. And then we have funny things like this. This is Henry VIII's, as when he was a young man. This was his suit of armor, and he was quite a young guy there, very trim, as opposed to this is Henry VIII's armor when he was a much older man, and you can see he kind of grew a little bit. But the exterior form really sort of tells us what's going on the interior on these armors. All right, then we're going to move out of interior and exterior and move on to primary and secondary forms. Okay, now this is a little bit, it's really actually very simple, but it's often tricky for people to understand this. The primary form, the primary contour here, is this silhouette. See where this is going? This is the primary contour. Okay, and secondary contours would be all this stuff in between here. Even these, this is kind of a neat piece here. This is called the Column of Trajan, and Trajan was one of the, general emperors of Rome. And this column actually still sits in the middle of Rome. You can see there's some railing around here to protect it. But then this spiraling bas-relief, basically carved bas-relief going up to the top here, is telling about all the exploits, battles, and this and that of Trajan's life here. So all of these things are seen as the secondary contours here, and the primary contour is just that silhouette, which, if we moved over to the street side of this, would be a very similar contour in this case, but a totally different one. because you would be seeing it from that side. And so the primary contour of Laocoon and his sons is this, right? Exterior silhouette of his angsty form with this asp, and his sons looking on, kind of a real family tragedy here. And all of this, these are the secondary contours, everything else that goes on inside here, including all this stuff, right? But if you moved over to the right-hand side and looked at it this way, you would see a side profile of Laocoon at the back of this son's head. You wouldn't even see this guy over here, right? You'd see a totally different primary contour. And then again, some of these other things, some of these other areas that were once primary become secondary. So it's constantly changing as you move. All right, so let's look at this. Now we're going to move on to this other large chapter in this lecture, and that is positive and negative form. And oftentimes, I don't want to introduce it as positive and negative space because that really is a two-dimensional description. But this gets a little bit confusing with the exterior and interior forms. I'm not really all that excited about explaining all this because when you're going to be talking to somebody in an art critique or reading a review in a magazine, they're probably going to be talking about positive and negative space, but sometimes they do talk about interior and exterior form. But we're getting real noodly here. But in this case, let's see if we can plump this up a little bit. Okay, this is a void here, right? Those dark spaces actually go through to the other side. You can see that background space there. And those are the negative forms. This solid area is the positive form, and that void is a negative form. Okay, the form here is this, in this case, is this long oval. The form here are these little dots, as opposed to, well, maybe we'll have something else that will help describe. We looked at that interior and exterior form where they were enclosed within a form. Sometimes there's actually even a hidden item inside. You can see inside to an inner form. Maybe we'll have something here again, positive and negative, and this negative is seen as a void, but it's not nothing, right? It's still a part of the piece. And this negative form, I mean, in this one, it really kind of duplicates the positive form here. And this one is just sort of a contrast to this bigger thing. I see these as sort of like a male and female form here. Personally, that's how I'm reading that. All right, and this is Le Corbusier is a very famous French architect, and this is one of his a little chapel. It's called Notre Dame de Haut, and here we are in the interior form of this building, which is this interior space, but we also see here the positive form of the walls here. And then there is this negative form of these window spaces, right? But they really aren't nothing at all. This is really probably the most interesting part of this building. It's because otherwise it looks sort of just like a rectangle with these really interesting cutouts going to the outside, which are these voids, and some of them have stained glass windows in them, but it starts to get real confusing here. Whoa, let's go back to that. This is Sol LeWitt. I don't have the name for this piece, but he kind of he was dabbling in all that minimalist stuff in cubes and things like that, and was very interested in materials. In this case, you can see he's got these geometric parts, these geometric elements that are insinuating cubes, right? Here's another one, and they're all a little bit different. And there's all this, we'll call it negative space in here. Here's the positive, which are these made of the material. And then there's this negative form in here, this negative space, you might call it. But it's really kind of insinuating or intimating a cube. Our minds, and we do this a lot with abstract work, our minds want to fill in and make sense. So in my mind, anyway, I'm filling in the part that isn't there. I mean, this is this activated cube space, more activated cube space. And so is this the exterior form? And this is the interior form? Or is this the positive form and the negative form? Sometimes they really cross the line, and I am never probably going to particularly ask you to make that discernment of which is positive and which is interior, or the negative and the interior as opposed to the positive and the exterior. I think you're just going to have to choose those terms or try and grasp what someone is saying as they are talking and describing something. Here again, this is another piece. So we do have some voids here, but there's also within this these funny blocks, right? These are sort of building blocks. It makes a screen here. It's pretty cool. There is this exterior form, but when we look through here, it's kind of an interior form with these positive areas, and then these negative forms also. You can see how tongue-tied I'm getting here, because it's just so hard to try and make a differentiation that makes any sense. All right, so let's move on to something that's a little more solid. And so that would be in the static and dynamic forms. And for that matter, if you look at your elements cheat sheet in your essential handouts, you will see these listings, these clumping of these concepts. Now we're moving on to this concept, which is static and dynamic form. So static is kind of the sense of appearing very stationary, like it's not going to move. And so what a better image than these pyramids that have been sitting here for millennia, and the winds, can be kind of crazy. We've all seen those funny action films. Anyway, the windstorms can be crazy. So this whole outside, all these sand dunes and everything are very static. And the wind, the storms that are moving these actual particles through space are very static in that they can seem like they're in motion. That's in contrast to these very stable, static forms. This is a big stone head, colossal stone head made by the Olmec people, a very old people down in southern Mexico. Really beautiful, very stylized facial features. And they're often just these big heads that are plopped down on the ground. Very static. Okay, as opposed to this figure, it's called Man in Motion. And you can see that he's sort of, is he going to get up? Is he leaning over against the wind? Is his chair falling over? What's going on there? So this is a very dynamic form, right? And another thing, when we get into sort of lines and direction lines, you'll notice that diagonals are seen as very dynamic. They're kind of something in motion. And so so we've got these directional, leaning, diagonal lines, and these forms that actually are taking their cue from those lines, from that primary contour, right? Everything is sort of in this very dynamic mode here of looking like it's going to go into motion or is in motion, and we just stopped it for a second. This is a door handle made during the Art Deco period, which is known for taking a lot of its design elements from plant life, vines, things seen growing and in motion. So it's sort of cool that the handle also actually does move. So this is sort of the kinetic part of this very dynamic door handle. And then even the interior of a building, and buildings are seen as pretty darn static, right? I mean, they sit on the ground. So this is the interior, which looks, at least from these pictures here, has a very dynamic feel about the movement of the inside of this piece. And here is the interior of a form that is, this is a building. This is sort of like, oh yeah, but what about this? This is a building, the Lautner House in Los Angeles. It is built on the side of a hill, and you would enter the building through an elevator that goes up to this kind of the fulcrum of where this spinning, not very quickly, but this turning house sits and rotates around on this. Just a side note, God, what's his name? Oh, I can't remember his name. The guy who was, oh, shoot. Well, anyway, cool story. I'll have to tell you sometime. Anyway, a static building in contrast to how most of them are, which is, I mean, a dynamic building. Blah, boy, I'm getting tongue-tied. All right, and now we're going to move on to something else, and this is the different degrees of likeness, the way we look at form. And everybody looks at, this is Michelangelo's David, and just to kind of go back on a few other things, even though he is static, but he looks like he is really very slowly, but going to be set into motion. He's kind of, the ankle, this muscle is very taut. This foot looks like it could kind of push off. He's got his arm ready here, sprung, ready to fling his rock, right? This looks like it's grabbing. There's real tension here. So he looks, it's kind of a dynamic form here in my eyes. But here we have Michelangelo, and everybody would say, well, he looks very representational, right? We've got representational or figurative forms that kind of copy something directly referring to something in real life in our own three-dimensional world. But then we move on to something like this, which is often called superrealism. And this is because it is taking a cast from a real live figure. This isn't a real live person. This is a cast, a replica of a real human being with polychrome paint on it, so it looks just like it's a real figure, right? So superrealism, I mean, Oh, there's little lines here for her waist. I mean, she's complete with scars and warts and, calloused bottoms of her feet, as opposed to Michelangelo, who has always been seen as the epitome of masculine beauty, right? So this is our idealized version, representational, our idealized version. Superrealism gives you warts, hair, scars, deformities and all, like in this piece. Um, Boy, this is a great image of compared to Michelangelo, who looked very dynamic or slowly dynamic. This is a very static piece, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is actually what you would call a stylized form. So we can tell it's representational, yes, we can tell it's a human form, but it takes on the style of the artists of this period in this part of the world, which would be in Judea, and it is rendered in the style of the time, right? I mean, it is representational, but it has a sort of stylization here, and this is called stylized. And certain artists have their own particular styles, right? Like this is actually we would call stylized also, but it is an abstract, right? It's referring to something real. So this is called the kiss. So we've got two people kissing here. Their bodies are just these blocks. You've got these other very stylized, abstracted, rectangular forms here that become the arms. And just this really teeny weeny connection in here where you see them kissing. I mean, their eyes, it's really sort of humorous. And you've got this, it's almost a symmetrical form here, right? Anyway, a lot of times people interchange abstract with stylized. So just know that it is kind of interchangeable, but this is an abstract form that is stylized in the style of Brancusi. So you can see that gets a little confusing as well. And the last one is totally sometimes called pure abstraction, but we're going to try and use the terms non-objective. So an object, we know what that is. It is something we recognize like a pen or something. But this is not a recognizable thing. And so often we'll call it non-objective or non-representational because it doesn't actually represent something in real life that we can refer to in our 3D world. This guy, Pevsner, was in the constructivist movement in Russia, and they did not want to try to imitate nature through descriptions of human beings or other tangible objects. They were really trying to explore the materials themselves. But with this piece, and I don't know what its name is, but you can see he's also really talking about energy and that whole idea of energetic dynamic movement with these lines that he's using here that are radiating out, these planes that are sort of shooting off into space. It almost looks like something from out in space, but nothing that is really referred to here. Let's just take another little look at this, the repetition and variety. So we've got these arcs here going on that are mimicked by, these are sort of negative arc spaces with positive arcs, right? And straight lines and curved lines. And so you can see there's this really complex compositions of geometrical forms that are radiating out, sometimes seen as static areas next to very dynamic areas, which makes abstract forms, abstract art, that's always the allure of it. You can kind of throw away everything you know and just become involved in the energy of the abstraction and everything going on within it, reflections and all of that. So that's kind of the end of what we were looking at. But I threw in a couple here at the end just to describe how I might look at these forms. So when I'm looking at this pot, words that would come into my mind are exterior form, and I know because it's a pot, because a friend of mine made this, there's an interior form here too, that volume, right? Volume is an empty space, but it is within a form, and the easiest way to think about it is within a bowl or within a vase or within a bottle or something like that. And here again, I know the way that you make a pot is by putting your hand inside and pushing out to make it kind of balloon out. It's got this energy so that you can almost sense that volume, that empty space in there pushing out on the inside. The same with the snake. She probably took a sponge and really pushed it out. There's a real energy about this piece. This is another piece of hers. This is Mary Anderson. She's a Calaveras potter. Vases are seen as very static sort of forms, right? This very classic, kind of almost Greek-looking vase here. But you've got these dynamic fish leaping up to the edge here, out of this watery glaze area that's got a texture that looks like it's also dynamic and moving like rippling water. So you can have forms that are really doing both or more than one thing, right? Static and dynamic. Okay, so let's talk about that whole idea of positive form, negative form, exterior and interior forms. So we've got a void here, right? That is a negative form, right? We can see right through there. It is a void. But this is actually a building on a beach, not an enclosed building, but sort of a like a little cabana sort of space. So here is we can't really see too much of the exterior form here, but we get a sense of the walls. But there's also an interior form here. We can liken it to that vase, right? There's this interior form as well. And this is positive, this part is negative. So you can see there's a lot of overlapping here, and it really, you can use these these terms very pinpointed if you need to go back to look at the definitions of these, but otherwise, a lot of times those terms will be used interchangeably. I love this image here. This is the inside of another one of these brick buildings, white buildings somewhere along the Mediterranean. And I don't know really what the outside looks like. Maybe it mimics a lot of this, but you get a real rich interior form here and interior forms within the interior form going on. And we can assume, looking at the light here, that there are negative forms as well that are voids there. So I'm just showing you the complexity and how you can get very tongue-tied like me on trying to explain this stuff. Okay, positive form, negative form, right? This void is the negative form. But negative often has this term, this connotation that it's a big nothing. Well, in this case, the negative form is the interesting part. It is the subject of this piece, the emptiness of this within this sort of bland, planar, rectangular form here. And I think this is by Jonathan Borofsky, and his subject matter is often seen as kind of the everyday man. So there he is trudging off to work. He's got his hat on, he's got his, his suit on, he's got his briefcase there. And I often am wondering whether he's just talking about how kind of what a drone and drudge you can be in your work life. That doesn't mean that you always are. I mean, I never feel that way. Not that I dress up with my hat and my suit and my briefcase, but that, that is something that you could become, this kind of big void and lose yourself. But then again, maybe we're really looking at this negative space and seeing the dynamic views of the sky go by. Maybe that's what he's trying to show here is the inner life of this guy, and that he's really, his mind is on nature or bigger things, the universe, the extent of space. So lots of different ways you could interpret a piece. This is an Alexander Calder piece, and he's the guy that does those mobiles, right? The things that move in space, the kinetic sculptures. This he calls stabiles, mobiles, stabiles, and because it doesn't move, although it is a very dynamic form. I mean, all of these things look like they're like a sea creature that's moving around and something grabbing out. Another way we could look at the interesting primary contour of this as opposed to the secondary contours. This is seen as a very, there again, we were talking about how it is a static piece. It's stable, it's a stabile, but it's very dynamic forms. I also like to mention that this is sort of another concept. This looks like it radiates out at least 3 different planes, right? In here, maybe more. And it's kind of an interesting way you could approach that cardboard long hop that I gave you. A lot of times we just see forms slotting together, two planes slotting, but you could slot more than 2, right? You could slot 3 or 4 and have this piece that radiates out from the center. Also, I would like to say that these spaces in between these different planes is the interior form here. These are interior forms. It's this activated space because this piece with these radiating parts really takes up this whole area and some really undisclosed area around it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but this is this activated space that is really part of the piece. So this is an interior form, and the exterior form on this starts to become a little bit different then. I guess it goes into all the ins and outs of these planes. Mentioning that, artists don't sit down and go, oh, I'm going to make an interior and exterior form, right? They just make what they want to make. And then people like us come behind and are studying it or trying to understand it or describe it to somebody else and talk about it and about the phenomena of what we're seeing. And we're the ones that give it these names. So don't think that, I'm finding it very complicated to explain all the different ways that you could describe this piece. Calder didn't have any of that in mind, probably. He was just making what he wanted to make, like we make what we want to make, right? It's just for people like us that are trying to describe it and talk about it and appreciate it. And sometimes describing something and saying its name really does make us appreciate it more, because it really makes us notice the complexities of these pieces. This last slide, this is a Bay Area artist called Bill Wareham. Hard to see because it's within the lobby of a building, but let's talk again about the positive forms and then these voids in here, these negative forms. And on a piece like this, we're going to call them negative shapes. I was talking about this to another student. I mean, you know, we look at this and we think, oh, well, this is the sculpture here, all these wonderful geometric arcs and planes and half spheres and et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that makes this so rich is if you can delineate here these negative forms or these interior forms, if you start looking at those as these window shapes, right, like that Corbusier building, that little chapel, I mean, you're starting to see two different worlds here, right? These colored parts and then these empty spaces, which actually are just as exciting and repeat these forms, right? When you get into abstract. So the repetition is on these interior areas as well as these exterior areas. So, you know, that's just how rich artwork is, right? And when we make pieces, we are making these positive things, but with the negative areas in mind, because they can be the repetitive forms. Right here we can see this half arc in here that's repeated here. This negative is repeating this. This kind of blocky form is kind of repeated over in here, etc. So that's what makes abstract work so fun. And it's not that you couldn't do this same sort of thing with representational work, but you kind of have to break it down into its basic and sort of the basic building blocks, which takes you into sort of that cubism and abstraction. So you can kind of use abstract forms, breaking down representational forms into abstract blocks and really creating your compositions that way. And that's kind of like the advanced version of what mature artists are doing, but that's what keeps them building, right? I mean, Bill Wareham, maybe he's been using these, 12 pieces or 15 pieces here over and over and over again. Maybe just like those little blocks that I handed to you guys. Maybe he just takes these same forms over and over and over again and puts them together in different ways, right? And it's infinite. I mean, this could be a kinetic piece of sculpture, but it isn't. But you see what I mean? Those things could be changing in space, the way we see the planets and the stars and the heavens and the asteroids and the wind and the dust, solar dust and all of that that's moving around. It's just an infinite thing. And that is what makes art so exciting to me, or one of the things. But as a maker, that's what makes it very exciting. So anyway, form is a really complex element. And I'll try and keep bringing these terms up, because that's the kind of thing that you're going to have to do on your final, which I have already published now. I believe it is in your essential handouts. I don't expect you to start looking at it for a while, but some of you are ready to do that. And maybe you do want to do that so you can be planning. But the descriptive part is what I will be pointing out as we look at other people's work throughout the semester, the descriptive part of just telling about the elements and the principles and all the vocabulary that goes with. So anyway, that is the end of the lecture on